Marcus was convinced he was a monster, not because of anything he had done, because of what he could not stop thinking. Every morning, he would pick up his infant daughter, and the thought would arrive before he had even crossed the room, unbidden, unwanted, and vivid. He would set her down quickly, back away, stand in the corner of the nursery while she cried, because being on the other side of the room felt like the only responsible thing left to do. His wife thought he was indifferent. His mother thought he was depressed. His doctor, the first one, agreed. Marcus knew none of that was right. He knew what was wrong. He was having thoughts, detailed, specific, horrifying thoughts that no good person should ever have. And he had them constantly. For 3 years, Marcus told no one. Because how do you tell someone that? How do you explain that you love your daughter more than anything in the world? And that love is exactly what makes the thoughts so unbearable. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is frequently misrepresented. The cultural shorthand, checking locks, washing hands, arranging objects in precise rows, describes only one visible surface of a disorder that exists on a broad and often hidden spectrum. Purely obsessional OCD, commonly called Pure O, sits at an extreme end of that spectrum. It is characterized by persistent, intrusive, and deeply distressing thoughts, obsessions, in the near-complete absence of visible external compulsions. The compulsions still exist. But in Pure O, they are internal. They are mental rituals, reviewing a memory repeatedly to check whether something bad happened, mentally rehearsing scenarios to test one's own reactions, silently reassuring oneself, or analyzing a thought from every angle to determine whether thinking it makes you dangerous. The result is a disorder that leaves no external trace. To anyone watching, the person with Pure O looks fine. They are not fine. Research suggests that Pure O affects roughly 1 to 2% of the population, though clinicians widely believe it is underdiagnosed because sufferers frequently conceal their thoughts out of shame or seek help for depression and anxiety without ever disclosing the obsessions beneath them. The intrusive thoughts that anchor Pure O tend to cluster around a person's most deeply held values. Those who are nurturing experience thoughts about harming the people they love. Those with strong religious convictions experience blasphemous or sacrilegious images. Those committed to their relationships experience unwanted doubts about their own sexuality or fidelity. The thoughts do not reflect desire. They reflect the mind attacking what matters most. Marcus's thoughts were what clinicians call harm OCD, a subtype in which the feared outcome is causing physical injury to another person, often someone the sufferer loves. He had been living inside them, alone, for years, before anyone gave them a name. Before the thoughts found their sharpest edge, Marcus was, by most reasonable measures, a settled man. He was 31 when his daughter was born. He worked as a high school biology teacher in a mid-sized city, a job he had chosen deliberately, with some deliberateness. He liked the idea of being useful to people at a formative age. His students remembered him as patient, demanding but not unkind. He brought the same quality home. His wife, Renata, would say later that Marcus was the kind of person who noticed things, who remembered that you mentioned once that you were nervous about something and asked about it weeks later. They had been together for 6 years before they married. Theirs was not a dramatic love story. It was a considered one. He coached a youth soccer league on Saturday mornings. He called his mother every Sunday. He was, in the language his friends used, solid. The first intrusive thoughts had come earlier, in his mid-20s, vague and transient. A fleeting image while driving that he might swerve into oncoming traffic. A momentary vision while standing on a subway platform of falling onto the tracks. He had mentioned this to a friend once, and the friend had laughed and said everyone had thoughts like that. Something about heights or edges or moving vehicles seemed to trigger a perverse flicker in the human brain. The friend was not wrong. Research on intrusive thoughts finds that the vast majority of people, upward of 90%, experience unwanted, distressing thoughts at some point. Most people notice them, feel briefly unsettled, and move on. Marcus could not move on, but back then, the thoughts were infrequent enough that he could manage them. It was the birth of his daughter that changed the frequency, changed everything. The first thought came on the third day after they brought her home. He was changing her diaper, and it appeared a single stark image, and he pulled his hands away from her as though he had touched something hot. He stood in the hallway for several minutes. Then he went back. He told himself it was exhaustion. Sleep deprivation does unusual things to the mind. He had read that. He believed it for a while. But over the following weeks, the thoughts multiplied. They were not all the same thought. They were variations on a theme. They occurred when he was bathing her, feeding her, carrying her downstairs. They occurred when he was holding a kitchen knife and heard her cry from the next room. He developed what he later described as a geography of avoidance. He stopped cooking when she was in the kitchen. He carried her upstairs but not down them. Downstairs felt more dangerous somehow, and he had negotiated a private rule with himself that he would not examine too closely. He handed her to Renata whenever he could, inventing small reasons. He was tired. He had to answer an email. He had to make a phone call. Renata began to interpret this as detachment. She mentioned it carefully at first, and then less carefully. Marcus did not explain. The explanation felt like a confession. If he said the words out loud, "I keep having thoughts about hurting her," he was certain something catastrophic would follow. He was not sure exactly what. Arrest, perhaps, or simply the look on Renata's face. The look that would confirm what he already suspected, that the thoughts were not random noise, but information, that they were telling him something true about who he was. He began to research at night, in the blue light of his phone, while Renata slept. He typed variations of his thoughts into search engines, half hoping and half dreading what he would find. What he found mostly was nothing useful. Forum posts that frightened him, articles about postpartum disorders that didn't quite fit, and an expanding certainty that he was alone in this, and that being alone in it was the only protection he could offer his family. By the time his daughter was 18 months old, Marcus had restructured his entire life around the thoughts, without anyone knowing he had done so. He had not told Renata. He had not told his doctor. He had seen his doctor twice in that period and been prescribed a low-dose antidepressant for what both of them agreed was probably new parent exhaustion and mild depression. The medication did not address the thoughts. It could not, because no one knew the thoughts were there. The mental rituals had become elaborate by this point. When a thought arrived, Marcus would analyze it. He would review it from every angle, asking himself whether it meant something, whether he had come close to acting on it, whether he had wanted to. This process could take hours. He described it later as like being a prosecutor and a defense attorney at the same time, inside your own head, in a trial that never reaches a verdict. The reviewing did not resolve the anxiety. It fed it. Each time he examined a thought, he was implicitly telling his brain that the thought was significant enough to examine. His brain responded accordingly. The thoughts grew more frequent, more detailed, and more distressing in direct proportion to the attention he gave them. He stopped going to his daughter's soccer class, the one he had enrolled her in optimistically before she could walk, because the other parents would hand her back to him without warning, and he needed to be ready. He stopped sleeping with a kitchen knife in the block on the counter and began storing it elsewhere. He had, by this point, read enough to understand that people with harm OCD virtually never act on their thoughts. He believed this intellectually. He did not feel it. There is a particular quality of suffering that comes from knowing something is irrational and feeling it with full force regardless. Marcus knew he was not dangerous. He felt every waking hour like a bomb that hadn't gone off yet. Renata asked for a separation in the spring of his daughter's second year. She told him she did not know who he was anymore. Marcus did not contest it. On some level, he agreed with her. What was happening in Marcus's brain during those years has a coherent neurological explanation, though coherent does not mean simple. Neuroimaging studies of individuals with OCD consistently identify hyperactivity in a circuit called the corticostratothalamocortical loop, a pathway involved in error detection, threat appraisal, and the filtering of irrelevant information. In individuals with OCD, this circuit misfires. The brain's error detection system, sometimes called the worry circuit, generates a signal that something is wrong, that a threat has been identified and not yet neutralized. In classic OCD, a physical compulsion neutralizes the signal temporarily. The hands are washed and the alarm quiets. In Pure O, the compulsion is mental, and mental compulsions are significantly harder to interrupt. Every time Marcus reviewed a thought, analyzed it, or sought internal reassurance, he was performing the equivalent of checking the lock. The alarm quieted for a moment, then it returned louder. The particular cruelty of harm OCD lies in its internal logic. The thoughts are ego-dystonic, meaning they are experienced as foreign, unwanted, contrary to the person's values and identity. This is clinically significant. Research consistently shows that individuals who experience harm-related intrusive thoughts in the context of OCD are not at elevated risk of acting on them. In fact, the inverse may be true. The more distressing the thought, the less likely it reflects genuine intention. Distress is itself the evidence of the gap between the thought and the self, but the disorder does not permit this reasoning to land. The OCD mind answers every reassurance with a new question. But are you sure? What if this time is different? What if your distress is performance? Marcus's mental rituals were not weakness. They were the mind's best attempt to manage an alarm that would not turn off. The tragedy is that the attempt made the alarm louder. Marcus was referred to a psychologist specializing in anxiety disorders 8 months after the separation. The referral came not from his doctor, but from a teacher at his school who had noticed something was wrong, and with some persistence asked him directly. In his first session, it took him 40 minutes to describe the thoughts. The psychologist listened without visible alarm. She told him the name, Harm OCD, a presentation within purely obsessional OCD. She told him what he was doing when he reviewed and analyzed the thoughts, and what that reviewing was costing him. She told him that the goal of treatment was not to eliminate the thoughts. Intrusive thoughts cannot simply be removed, but to change his relationship to them, to stop treating them as evidence. The treatment was exposure and response prevention, or ERP. In Marcus's case, this meant, counterintuitively, sitting with the thoughts without performing mental rituals in response. It meant tolerating the uncertainty rather than resolving it. It meant learning to treat the thought as noise, not signal. Progress was not linear. It rarely is with OCD. There were weeks where the thoughts intensified before they loosened. There were sessions Marcus described as the worst hours of his adult life. But over 18 months, the frequency and grip of the thoughts diminished. He did not become a person who never had disturbing thoughts. He became a person who understood what they were. He and Renata did not reconcile. That loss was real, and therapy acknowledged it as real, not as a symptom to be processed away. His daughter's 4 now. He sees her several days a week. He picks her up at the door and carries her in. What Marcus's case reveals is something that sits at the uncomfortable edge of how we think about thought itself. We tend to believe that what we think reflects who we are, that the mind is a reliable narrator of the self. Purely obsessional OCD is a direct challenge to that assumption. It demonstrates that the brain can generate content that is entirely alien to the person experiencing it, and that the experience of that content, the horror, the resistance, the refusal, is precisely what distinguishes a person of conscience from what their thoughts appear to describe. The most frightening thoughts Marcus ever had were the proof that he was not what he feared. He just couldn't feel that, not for a long time. That is the condition. That is what it costs. If you like unsettling psychology, like and subscribe for a new diagnosis each week.